Why were Southerners long barred from the presidency, you ask? Well, the first thing I have to say is there was never any formal ban on Southerners in the presidency, but consider this. During the first several decades of American history under the Constitution, Southerners dominated the White House. And so if you look at George Washington, Southerner from Virginia, John Adams, a Northerner, but then Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, skip John Quincy Adams, but Andrew Jackson, and then continuing up until the 1840s, Southerners were the dominant force in the American presidency. But then suddenly, no Southerners. From the Civil War, well actually, from 1848, before the Civil War, while the sectional crisis is getting particularly deep, from 1848 until 1964, no Southerner was elected to the presidency. And by Southerner, I mean someone from a state of the former Confederacy. So somebody who lived most of his life in a state of the former Confederacy. So during that period, the South was basically blacked out of the White House. And the question I put, or the question that I'm going to deal with, is why was this so? So I'll let you think about it for a minute. So what was different? Why Southerners before the Civil War? Why no Southerners from starting a little bit before the Civil War until, well, the 1960s? And I should add that from 1964 into the 21st century, there have been Southerners all over the place once again. So Southerners have been at least comparably represented to the number of their population as the population of a whole. So Southerners all over the place early, no Southerners for a long stretch, and then Southerners again. What's going on in that interim period? Well, the answer is what was going on was the Civil War, Reconstruction, and then the period of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow system of segregation. So once the nation goes to the Civil War, one can understand why Southerners don't get elected president, because the South was the region of the country that seceded. The South was, in the thinking of Northerners, and actually in the thinking of Southerners as well, the South was the cause of the Civil War, although Southerners considered the cause to be just. Anyway, so the South had caused the Civil War. And in the thinking of Northerners, and I need to add here that by the end of the Civil War, the population, by the end of the Civil War, the population of the North much outstripped the population of the South. And the population of the North would continue to grow much more rapidly than the population of the South until late in the 20th century, when the new Sun Belt would begin to catch up. But so one reason that the South was shut out of the presidency was that it was losing population relative to the rest of the country. But that really begs the question a little bit, because one asks, so why was the South losing population relative to the rest of the country? And that is, again, because of the system of Jim Crow segregation. The South was very much less attractive to immigrants who feared that they would be working with black people, in competition with black people who were getting paid dirt poor wages because of the Jim Crow system. Under the system of slavery, and then continuing under the system of Jim Crow, manual labor was devalued, and this wasn't really any good for immigrants who, the only thing they had to sell, many of them, was their manual labor, so they tended to go to the North. But the overriding reason was that the South was the land of Jim Crow segregation. The South was this world apart, and it was, well, not to put too fine a point on it, it was an embarrassment to much of the rest of the country. Northerners didn't like to be reminded that the constitutional rights of a large portion of the American population were being violated on a daily basis. They didn't like to be reminded of it. Now, they weren't so upset about it that they did anything about it, as in taking measures, passing federal laws to force the South to comply. Now, Northerners, and I'll include Westerners in this too, they just sort of didn't want to be bothered, didn't want to be reminded. So the result of this was that they didn't really pay much attention to the Jim Crow system until it looked like some Southerner might get nominated for president or elected president. And so it became very clear pretty early on that Northern voters, whose votes, at least a large number of votes of whom, were necessary to elect anybody president, that they wouldn't accept a Southern candidate. And so the parties caught on to this. Now, the Democratic Party was the party of the South in those days, so that the Democrats didn't even bother to nominate Southerners because they knew they couldn't get elected. Now, there were a few sort of partial exceptions to this rule. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was president, became president upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was from Tennessee. But if you were listening carefully at the beginning, I said weren't elected president. Andrew Johnson was not elected. In fact, he was impeached and nearly convicted, and he didn't even bother trying for re-election, or election in his own right, in 1868. Woodrow Wilson had been born in the South. He'd been born in Virginia. He grew up in Georgia, but he moved to the North and spent most of his adult life in the North. He was governor of New Jersey when he was elected to the presidency in 1912. So the Southernism in him had been largely rubbed off. Harry Truman was from Missouri. Missouri had been a slave state, but it wasn't a state of the Confederacy, and I made that distinction there. Even then, Harry Truman could not have gotten elected in his own right. He became president only upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and he had been Roosevelt's vice president. Now, he did win election in his own right in 1948, but again, he wasn't from a state of the former Confederacy. Missouri was one of those border states, a slave state that did not leave the Union. Now, one person who was quite aware of this ban on Southern presidents was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was as capable a politician as this country has seen in the 20th century. He was as ambitious a politician as this country has seen probably its entire history. And he knew, however, that he could probably never be president of the United States until something changed, until Americans in the rest of the country got over their concern about Southern candidates. How could they get over their concern about Southern candidates? Well, basically, the Jim Crow system would have to be remedied. The Jim Crow system would have to be eliminated. The South would have to be dragged into the 20th century. Now, in fact, this is exactly what Lyndon Johnson wanted to do. From the time he was a young man, Lyndon Johnson made it his cause to do what he could to ensure that black people and brown people, that African Americans and Latinos would have as good a shot at opportunities, good a shot at a decent living in the United States as white people could. And so this was one of Lyndon Johnson's causes in politics. But he realized that he couldn't accomplish this until he became president, because it required that kind of presidential leadership. But because of the ban on Southern presidents, so there was this kind of, well, there's a term, is a catch-22, which means something that can't be fixed until the thing itself is fixed. Basically, Johnson was in a position where he couldn't become president until the Jim Crow system was eliminated. But the Jim Crow system couldn't be eliminated until he, or somebody like him, another Southerner, was president. Because Southerners, they would never accept this change at the behest, on the insistence of any Northerner. They would say, what's a Yankee doing trying to tell us how to live our lives? They might be talked into it by a Southerner. So a Southerner had to be president before the Jim Crow system could be ended. But the Jim Crow system couldn't be ended until a Southerner became president. So there was this situation, this kind of dead end, and nobody could quite figure out how to get around it. Johnson did the best he could, and this is why Johnson accepted John Kennedy's offer of the vice presidential nomination in 1960. Kennedy apparently was surprised when Johnson said yes, because Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader. This was a much more powerful position than Vice President of the United States. But Johnson, I think, had this idea that if he was vice president for a term or two, then people would get used to thinking of him, addressing him, not as the senator from Texas, but as the vice president of the United States. And just as with Woodrow Wilson, that Southern background would kind of brush off. And conceivably, by 1968, he might be enough of a national figure that he could get elected. Now, in fact, that's not how it happened. John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became president, and in fact, in short order. He pushed the Civil Rights Act through Congress. It was followed with a Voting Rights Act. The Jim Crow system ended. Johnson ran for election in his own right in Johnson ran for election in his own right in 1964, and he won in a landslide. The Vietnam War prevented him from running again in 1968. He could have, but he didn't. But he was succeeded by a Southerner, succeeded him, not immediately. So he was succeeded by Richard Nixon from California. But Jimmy Carter, another Southerner, became president in the late 1970s. George Bush the Elder from Texas was president in the late 1980s, early 1990s. His son, George W. Bush, was president for 2 terms in the early 2000s. So the blockade against Southern presidents was ended by the presidency of that Southerner, Lyndon Johnson, who under normal circumstances couldn't have become president in his own right. Johnson could not have gotten in the front door of the White House. He had to come in the side door through the death of his predecessor. But once he was in there, he kicked open the front door to Southerners. And so Southerners who had been in the presidency before the Civil War now were back in the presidency, and today they have as good a shot at becoming president as anybody else.